So it's my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Calum Miller today. The abortion debate's often seen as a dilemma between the well-being of the mother on the one hand and the well-being of the child on the other. For pro-lifers, the child's right to life outweighs the mother's right to choose. But in fact, the empirical evidence suggests that abortion has, on the whole, been detrimental not only to unborn lives, but also to women generally. And this is what Dr. Calum Miller is going to elucidate for us today. So Calum is a medical doctor. He's based in the UK. He's a research associate at the University of Oxford, researching abortion ethics and policy. He's spoken widely on national media and across the world to professional groups and politicians on the harms of abortion and the need to protect both mother and child. He's taken part in numerous debates, including with the former CEO of the UK's leading private abortion provider, and he's published on a wide range of topics in peer-reviewed journals and won prizes from the University of Oxford and the Royal College of Psychiatrists for his work on medical ethics. So, Calum, it's a real delight to have you here today, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you to everyone as well who's taken the time out of their day to talk and listen to a discussion about this incredibly important topic, which I know has been discussed in this forum multiple times before, and of course is very timely this week in particular with a global debate about this topic. I really became pro-life, as you might put it, or pro both lives during medical school. So I was not pro-life when I entered medical school. I wasn't raised with that sort of belief. And it was really the discussions that I had while I was studying at Oxford and thinking about this topic, seeing the effect of abortion on both the unborn child and on the woman, that really led me to becoming pro-life and looking into this area more deeply. And so as time has gone on, both during clinical practice and during my academic research, I've looked more and more at how abortion impacts society more generally. We're often told that if you're pro-life, you're prioritizing the baby over the mother. But actually, what I came to find after years now of research on this topic is that abortion has been harmful to women, and that the interests of the child and the interests of the mother go hand in hand. What harms a baby harms the baby's mother. And that's a sort of universal rule of parenthood, that when a child is harmed, their parents are harmed, because parents and children, their well-being goes together. And this is what the evidence shows in practice. And so I want to share with you some of the ways in which abortion has been harmful, not only, of course, to the many unborn lives which are lost through abortion, but also to the women who become secondary victims of this industry and of this practice. So I'm going to be sharing just a few of the ways in which abortion is harmful for women and talking a bit about those. And there's obviously a huge amount more that could be said as well. The only other thing that I'll say before beginning is that I know you are from all over the world, and it's wonderful to have people from every corner, well, if there were corners of the planet. If there's any way that I can help your domestic pro-life work, or in the medical field or in the advocacy field, please do get in touch afterwards, and I'd be glad to try and help build a pro-life culture or maintain a pro-life culture in your respective countries. In the UK, we don't have a pro-life culture at all, and so I'm very much in the minority, but I hope that we can change that over time. So the first way in which abortion is harmful to women is sort of hinted at by the United Nations Population Fund, which in a sense is ironic, because the United Nations Population Fund is one of the main advocates of abortion around the world, mainly as a tool of population control. But they note that 126 million women are missing around the world because of son preference and gender-biased sex selection. Now, what they don't mention is that a significant proportion of these missing women are missing specifically because of sex-selective abortion. This is data from the University of Oxford, from a variety of published studies, and it has shown that since it has become possible to determine the sex of a child in the womb through ultrasound technology around the 1970s and 80s, the number of unborn baby girls who have been aborted simply because they are baby girls has risen dramatically over time, so that now there are nearly 2 million baby girls who are aborted every year simply because they are girls. And that's ignoring all the other baby girls who were aborted for other reasons. Nearly 2 million are aborted simply on the grounds that they are girls and would have survived if they were boys. This is, of course, widely condemned by all sorts of human rights bodies, even ones that generally support abortion. So, for example, the European Parliament condemns prenatal sex selection and condemns sex-selective abortion, and in fact required European countries to introduce laws to prohibit sex-selective abortion. But of course, very few European countries have actually done so, and sex-selective abortion remains legal, at least in practice, in many of those countries. Here's one example. It was found a few years ago that even in the UK, a significant number of baby girls were being aborted on the grounds that they were baby girls. And one of our parliamentary parties called for a ban on the misuse of this screening in order to perform sex-selective abortions. But that same party just a few years ago voted on whether to ban sex-selective abortion and overwhelmingly voted against banning it. They voted to keep sex selection abortion legal in the UK, and so it sadly remains to this day. Now, this means that sex-selective abortion is one of the most powerful, potent tools that misogynistic forces have globally to reduce the visibility and the voice and the presence of women. There are few things or practices or industries in the world which lead to the systematic destruction of 2 million women every single year, but abortion is one of those. And of course, it doesn't just mean that women are less present and visible and active in society. It has downstream effects. When in certain parts of the world, the ratio between men and women is significant, as in parts of China and India in particular, it has downstream effects. If there are a whole load of men in a particular region who cannot find wives, who cannot find partners, this actually fuels sex trafficking and bride trafficking. And so we know that there's a significant increase in demand for trafficking of women in certain parts of the world because there are so few women around in society. So men, in a sense, want women around when they are older, but don't want women around as children. They're not prepared to look after them in their childhood. And so this fuels sex trafficking and bride trafficking and a variety of other social problems. A second way in which legalized abortion has contributed to negative repercussions for women is because so many abortions are coerced, either by men or by doctors or by family members or by friends or by abortion providers. And all of these are relatively common. We know that several studies showed that about 20 to 25% of abortions are done under the pressure or enforcement of other people, particularly the male partner. This was true in Norway, a very liberal feminist country. It was true in the UK, likewise. And it was also true in the Republic of Congo and Gabon in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a global phenomenon that forced abortion is very common. And this isn't just forced abortion in a sort of outright coercive way. We know that all sorts of societal pressures contribute to abortions that women don't ultimately want. For example, it was found in Scotland, which again is a very feminist, progressive country. 3/4 of pregnant women and new mothers in Scotland claimed that they were the victims of discrimination because of their having a child. And this inevitably creates pressure on women not to have a child. It was seen that in Ireland, after it legalized abortion a few years ago, within a few months, female pilots in Ireland were being told that they should have an abortion if they got pregnant or they would lose their jobs. This has not been liberating for women. Likewise, we know that abortion providers and doctors themselves coerce abortions. It's been found that abortion providers have targets for the numbers of abortions they should perform. In the UK, Marie Stopes, which of course is very widely prevalent around the world, Marie Stopes were found in the UK to have pressured women into having abortions. They even had a company-wide policy that if a woman decided not to have an abortion, they would be called up again on the phone in order to encourage them to reconsider. And likewise, there were attempts to give women abortions without gaining proper informed consent. And of course, if you don't have informed consent, then you don't have consent. And so these were non-consensual abortions being provided by Marie Stopes in the UK, particularly to children and disabled women. And of course, it goes without saying that this is when they were on their best behavior. This is when Marie Stopes were being watched and visited by the hospital regulators. So we can only imagine what happens and takes place when the hospital regulators are not watching. Just as an example, they had target abortion rates of 98 to 100%. What that means is that they expected every woman who came considering an abortion to have one. And if this didn't take place, they regarded it as a failure. And staff would actually be paid more if they got women to go ahead and proceed with abortions. And so there's much more that could be said about this. In another example, coerced abortion takes place by normal public health sector doctors. It's widely agreed that coerced abortion is a brutal human rights abuse, again, by bodies which normally support abortion. In the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the committee which generally the UN committees support abortion, this committee said that forced and coerced abortion was a brutal form of discrimination against disabled women. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe said that forced abortion should be criminalized. A UN special rapporteur, who again are usually pro-abortion, said that forced abortion on disabled women is a form of torture, and so on. And yet we know that this happens in the UK to disabled women. Just a couple of years ago, there was a woman who was of Nigerian origin in the UK. She was in her 20s and she was 22 weeks pregnant, which means that the baby could even have possibly survived outside of the womb. But she had what was described as a mild to moderate learning disability. Now, the woman's mother was a midwife. She had a social worker as well. The mother or the grandmother, who was a midwife, and the social worker both agreed that the baby should be kept and that the woman wanted the baby to be kept and the baby could be looked after. The judge in the case also said that the woman wanted to keep the baby. But because doctors thought that it would be bad for the woman, they tried to force this disabled woman to have an abortion. And when the woman refused, they took her to court, where a judge ordered the woman to be given a forced abortion. And they said in one of the news articles that in order to placate or appease the woman who did not wish to have an abortion, doctors simply told her that she would be given a new doll to play with instead of her baby. Now, fortunately, in this case, it had a positive ending. At the very last minute, money was raised for the woman to appeal, and the appeal court overturned this judgment. But we know that in other cases, these judgments have not been overturned, and disabled women have been subject to coerced abortion at the hands of doctors, even in supposedly progressive pro-human rights countries like the UK. You can judge for yourself whether we have earned those labels. The third way in which abortion has been harmful to women's mental health is something I should give a mention to Dr. Peter Saunders for, since he has done a huge amount of work on this and was one of the people who got me into this subject in the first place. Most abortions in the UK are done for mental health reasons, and that is because most abortions are not done because a woman's life is at risk, or because she is the victim of sexual crime, or because the baby has a disability. Almost all abortions are done for socioeconomic reasons, and in many countries, these are described officially as mental health reasons because the law is strict, at least on paper. But of course, there is no evidence for this. So despite many abortion advocates claiming that abortion is needed for women's mental well-being, it's actually widely agreed that there's no evidence that abortion helps a woman's mental well-being. David Ferguson was one of the leading researcher on this topic. He was pro-choice. He thought that abortion should be legal and supported it. But he was an honest psychologist who performed top-class research on this topic. And so he concluded that at the present time, there is no credible scientific evidence demonstrating that abortion has mental health benefits, and that we shouldn't be performing abortions that are clinically unwarranted on the grounds of a clinical indication. We should just admit and be honest that we are doing this for socioeconomic reasons, not because the woman's mental well-being is genuinely at stake. He actually went much further, and despite being pro-choice, he said that the evidence is now fairly clear that when a woman has an unwanted pregnancy, we're ignoring the women who have wanted pregnancies, we're only talking about women with unwanted pregnancies. If a woman has an abortion in that situation, she will have significantly worse mental health outcomes than if she continued the unwanted pregnancy. He found that women who had an abortion had a 28% increased risk of anxiety, a 78% increased risk of suicidal behavior, a 130% increased risk of alcohol misuse, and a nearly 300% increased risk of drug misuse. We also know from other studies that the risk of PTSD after an abortion ranges from about 1.5% to 14%. Now, this might seem like a small percentage, but even the minimum estimate there, 1.5%, would lead to an enormous number of women suffering PTSD as a result of abortion. In the UK, for example, there are 200,000 abortions each year. So 1.5% of that would be 3,000 women. And because PTSD can be easily linked to a specific causal event, there is no debate in these situations whether the abortion was really the cause of the mental health difficulties. These are women with abortion-specific PTSD symptoms, and at least 3,000 women in the UK develop PTSD specifically as a result of their abortion. And the real number may be significantly higher, and so on in other countries. Another statistic that's not widely known about mental health is a study that was done on women who were refused or denied abortions several years ago. This was done in the US, and the study was generally used in order to say that denying women an abortion causes all sorts of problems for the women. But what the study actually found, though it didn't publicize this, was that when women were denied an abortion, 3/4 of those women went on to have the baby. And this shows, firstly, that pro-life laws work. If being denied an abortion means that you're overwhelmingly likely to keep the pregnancy, it means that the law and policies protecting unborn children really do have an impact and do protect lives, and they do prevent many, many abortions from taking place. But the most remarkable thing they found was that of those women who kept the baby and who raised the baby, 98% of them were glad that they did not have an abortion in retrospect. That means that almost every woman who is denied an abortion and keeps the baby is glad that they were denied an abortion. So stories of large numbers of women having terrible psychological outcomes because they were denied an abortion simply aren't true. We know that the overwhelming majority of women, almost all of them, are glad in the end that they had an abortion. A fourth way in which abortion has been harmful for women is through the impact on mortality. And this is a huge debate with a lot of different elements, and I can't go into detail on it here. But one of the key points comes from the previous thing I mentioned. We know that suicide is significantly linked with abortion. And this is very intuitive because we know for a fact that pregnancy and childbirth are strongly protective factors against suicide. Abortion removes those factors protecting women against suicide, and it adds a traumatic event to women. And so it's only natural that abortion would increase a woman's suicide risk. But in fact, in many countries like the UK, maternal suicide is the second largest cause of direct maternal deaths within 6 weeks of the pregnancy. And if you take maternal deaths up to a year after the pregnancy, suicide is the leading cause of maternal death. But we know that suicide and abortion are closely linked. And what this means is that women who have an abortion are at a significantly increased risk of dying after an abortion compared to continuing pregnancy. So, for example, this data is from Finland, which has very good evidence on abortion and outcomes because the documentation is very good. They found that a woman who becomes pregnant and keeps the baby has a lower than average suicide risk. But a woman who has an abortion has a far, far higher than average suicide risk. And because suicide is the leading cause of maternal death in Finland, what you find is that the mortality risk for pregnant women is much lower than average, but the mortality risk for women having an abortion is again much higher than average. A fifth way that abortion has been harmful for women is because it increases the risk of preterm birth. And the evidence is now fairly clear on this. It's one of the few associations with abortion that even abortion advocates and providers admit is a genuine association, though some of them claim that there is not a causal association between them. But we know that having one abortion increases your risk of preterm birth by about 30%, and multiple abortions dramatically increase that risk much further still. And it increases the risk of very early preterm births, which of course have much more health consequences by an increased amount still. Even the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, which try to downplay the causal association, say that the reason for this association may well be cervical trauma as a result of the abortion. And of course, preterm births have a huge effect on public health more generally. We know that in the US, very early preterm births alone, about 23,000 of those are thought to be caused each year by abortion, as are about 2,000 cases of cerebral palsy, which lead to enormous healthcare costs of over $1 billion a year, simply in neonatal costs, looking after for premature babies. And that doesn't include all the extra health costs throughout the child's life that will be there as a result of that premature birth. And of course, as many of you will know, preterm birth complications are the leading cause of death among children under the age of 5. And in 2015 were thought to be responsible for about 1 million deaths in that year. And so preterm birth is a very significant public health problem and is widely agreed, though not universally agreed, to be often a result of a previous abortion taking place in the mother. And the final thing I want to say before we have a short time of question and answer, where I'll do my best to answer questions about this and to respond to any objections you might have, is the effect that abortion has on the culture in a society. Now, this is a bit more complicated, so bear with me. We know that when abortion is made possible, it means that you can escape some of the responsibilities of having sex with someone that you might not be prepared to be married to or to become a parent with. And so abortion access increases uncommitted sex. It increases the number of people having sex who are not committed to each other and who are not committed to having a child. Now, this has negative impacts on women in two ways. Firstly, it completely liberates men from the burdens of unwanted pregnancy. Although abortion has often been seen to liberate women, it still does so at a cost, because a woman who gets pregnant will have to either deal with an unwanted pregnancy by herself and have a child by herself, or she will have to have an abortion, which is a traumatic event that causes significant distress. Whereas for the man has none of these costs or burdens. A man can simply have sex, walk away, and say to the woman, if you don't want the child, you should deal with it yourself. And so what this means is that the burden of unwanted pregnancy, which massively increases when abortion is legalized, that burden falls almost entirely on the woman, whereas men can walk away. Another way that this has been harmful is that because men have been entitled to walk away by the legalization of abortion, families break down. And because we know that families staying together is one of the leading causes of economic growth and development and prosperity, family breakdown is one of the leading causes of economic difficulty and poverty. And this is almost all something that falls, again, disproportionately on the women and disproportionately on poor women. As an example, this was a Nobel Economics Prize winner, George Akerlof, and his wife co-authoring a paper. His wife is now the Secretary of the Treasury in President Biden's US government. And there was a third co-author his credentials are not so relevant here. But these are generally liberal, progressive people who we may imagine are likely to be pro-choice and certainly very credentialed in economics. They said that over the last 25 years, i.e. since abortion and contraception were legalized in the US, disturbing trends have occurred in the United States and in other Western countries which legalized abortion. Just at the time, about 1970, that the permanent cure to poverty seemed to be on the horizon, single motherhood and the feminization of poverty began their long and steady rise. As a result, United States poverty rates have been stubbornly constant for the last quarter century. What this means is that the US was well on its way to eliminating and curing the problem of poverty. But specifically because of family breakdown as a result of abortion, there was a huge increase in poverty, which largely fell on women, and poor women in particular. This is a problem that has dramatically changed the realities of everyday life for thousands and indeed millions of women in the United States, and it can be directly traced to the legalization of abortion. Now, of course, there are many other problems with family breakdown on society. We know that family breakdown is associated with many negative outcomes, both for the parents and for the children, including more violence and crime, some of which, of course, is directed towards women. We know that the decline in marriage has been responsible for a significant increase in child poverty and indeed in inequality, and particularly racial inequality in the US. One of the other things one of the authors noted in a separate paper is that because men have been entitled to simply walk away from women and not have any responsibility for their partner or for the child, this has liberated men to continue a life of adolescence, in a sense. So all those teenage boys who grow up maybe robbing newsagents or robbing, supermarkets, who do kind of small-time crime, if they have no responsibility for a partner or for children, they are more likely to persist in those violent habits. And so what happens is that men without those responsibilities develop increasing and more serious criminal tendencies, including violent crime and drug use and so on. And of course, this has a significant impact on women who are often the victims of those things. Now, there's far more that could be said about all of that. There's a huge amount more that could be said about all of that, but I want to give plenty of time for questions and answers. So the final thing that I will say here is that I've whizzed very, very quickly through a lot of this evidence. And you may be thinking, what are the references for this? Is there more to it? The answer is yes. So I have on my website a comprehensive question and answer on the topic of abortion. Pretty much any question that you might want to ask about this topic, there will be answers to those questions and references to academic papers backing up what I say. So please do use that as a resource. Please feel free to share it. Feel free to copy and paste it and use it in defense of mothers and unborn children. And as I said at the start, if there's any way that I can support your work in all the different countries around the world from which you are, I'd be delighted to help. So please do get in touch, and I do my very best to offer you resources and advice and suggestions on how to make good use of these resources. So thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for your interest in this topic. And I'd love to be very open to questions, including objections that you might have. I think it's great to have an open, honest forum for discussion. And so please do fire away with questions, and I will hand back over to Peter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Calum, for a very comprehensive overview of many of the areas where women's health is impacted. And we're all aware this is a very controversial and often emotive subject as well. So the questions are starting to pour in. There's one that's right at the top in terms of upvotes, Calum. Let me start with this one from Marissa Resulta, who is a pediatrician based in the Philippines. She says, I see you sexually abuse children, and when we see an acute case, we give emergency oral contraceptive pills to avoid the child from getting pregnant. Is it right for us as Christian doctors to do this, or are we somehow being instrumental in preventing these abused children to continue with their pregnancy? So I guess there's two elements to this question. One is the effect on the baby or the embryo, and the other on the mother.
No, thank you for that important question, and thank you for your work as well, Marissa, in looking after these vulnerable victims as children of sexual abuse. It's such a horrendous crime. It's difficult to even think about, but I'm grateful for the work that you do in supporting those children. What I would say is that there is still seemingly an open debate about whether emergency contraception works as an abortifacient. What I mean by that is the key question for Christians, and indeed for anyone kind of interested in human rights, is, does this end the life of a human being? There was a study just a couple of years ago which surveyed 5,500 biologists, and it found that 95% of them agreed that a new human organism is created at fertilization. And likewise, this fits with what we know from the biblical passages about life beginning in the womb and beginning at conception, even though they didn't know the details of fertilization. So the key question for us is, does this end the life of a child after fertilization? What I would say there is that some kinds of emergency contraception certainly do so. So we know that the copper coil, for example, used as an emergency intrauterine device, does in some cases operate after fertilization. And we know that as a fairly uncontroversial fact. What is more controversial, I have my own views on it, is whether other emergency contraception like levonorgestrel or ulipristal work as abortifacients, meaning that they work after fertilization. It's difficult for me to give a definitive answer because I'm not an expert in that topic, and different pro-life people genuinely do have different views. But I would encourage you to look at the best case for the, I suppose, cautious view on this topic. There's a biologist called Bruno Motzenegger. I'll put it in the chat, his name, so you know how to spell it. Motzenegger has done some of the best work arguing that these other emergency contraceptives do operate after fertilization. It's probably best if I let you read his work and make that decision and judgment for yourself rather than giving you a definitive answer. But I would say that there is significant debate, even though some people who are pro-abortion try and say that there's no way that these medications operate after fertilization. It seems, in my view, that there is a significant chance that they do, but I will post his name in the chat and let you make that judgment yourself based on his papers. So thank you for that very important question. I'd be glad to talk about it more another time.
Thanks, Calum. And the second question here, it's anonymous, but I think one that many people would be asking and are upvoting. In the UK, it was Sir David Steele who was instrumental in getting the original Abortion Act passed. And one of his concerns that motivated him in doing that was the number of backstreet abortions. So people were seeking unsafe, often not from medical practitioners and so on, it was argued, and that he did this in order to save those lives of women. So can you give us your views on the question of backstreet abortions, whether legalizing it really reduces them? Was this a genuine reason on the basis of the evidence?
Yes, thank you for that question as well, which I think is a perfectly good and sincere question. It's a question I wrestled with for a long time, because normally pro-lifers simply would say that, yes, legalizing abortion will make it safer, but nevertheless, the unborn child has to have legal protection as a matter of justice. And so whatever the consequences are, we have to put that equality and justice into law. Whatever you think of that response, what I have done over the last couple of years, and I'm actually writing a book on this topic, is looking at the empirical evidence that legalizing abortion reduces the number of unsafe abortions. Having looked at this now for a good few years and writing much on this, I've published a couple of papers on it. The first thing to say is that pro-life laws do reduce the number of abortions. Perhaps the best evidence for that is the study I mentioned earlier, which showed that when women are denied abortions, 75% of them go on to have their child. That's a pretty direct and clear piece of evidence showing that restricting access to abortion does enable and empower women to continue their pregnancies. And in almost all of those cases, they are glad that they did so. Now, the second question about whether legalizing abortion makes it safer for women. Of course, in some sense, in a very obvious sense, having an abortion performed by a trained medical professional is going to be safer than a woman using a very unsafe method in an illegal context. But that doesn't necessarily mean that legalizing abortion will reduce the number of women who die from backstreet abortions. So in fact, I'm writing a chapter on this at this very moment and hopefully finishing tomorrow. I've surveyed a huge range of countries across the globe, including the UK, but also including countries in Africa like Ethiopia, Zambia, South Africa, countries in Latin America like Chile and Uruguay and Cuba, countries in the Middle East like Tunisia, countries in Asia like India, a huge range of countries. And I have found that in no case has there been convincing evidence that legalizing abortion has reduced the number of women who die from abortions. In fact, in some cases, it has simply led to worse problems. And a good example is Ethiopia. Ethiopia legalized abortion around 2006. And there are multiple studies showing that during that period of legalization and for 10 years afterwards, the number of legal abortions increased up to about 300,000 legal abortions every year in Ethiopia. But when you look at the number of illegal abortions, the number of illegal abortions has not changed at all. Just as many women are obtaining illegal abortions in Ethiopia as before it was legalized. So the only thing that has changed in Ethiopia is that more women are having abortions. It hasn't meant that women are getting safer abortions. And in fact, the women that were admitted to hospital having had those abortions after legalization were actually much more unwell. There was a significant increase in the number of women with organ failure, septic shock, peritonitis, and so on. That's a particular country that I have a paper on. So if you look up a paper, Calum Miller in the Ethiopian Medical Journal, it came out just a couple of months ago. If you want to look further into that case study, if you want to know more generally about this topic, please do get in touch and I would be glad to share more of the evidence on that, including the evidence for the UK specifically.
Thanks, Calum. From David Knight here, the question, is there any research comparing or contrasting the outcomes and negative effects of medical abortion on the one hand versus spontaneous miscarriage on the other? Perhaps specifically with relation to the issues you mentioned around mental health problems and premature births. Is abortion any more damaging to those things than a spontaneous miscarriage?
Yeah, thank you for that question as well, David. The honest answer, which will be unsatisfying, but hopefully will allow us to get through as many questions as possible, is that I don't know which evidence has looked at this. So there certainly is evidence comparing the mental health outcomes of spontaneous and illegal abortion. Spontaneous and induced abortion. So that evidence certainly does exist. I know that Priscilla Coleman is one of the leading researchers who has looked at some of that evidence. And so if you look up Priscilla Coleman's work, she will have written about it. It's very likely that David Reardon has written about it as well. So I'll write those names in the chat. But I don't know that specific literature in detail about that comparison. So I can't share the results of that. But there certainly is literature, and those authors would be a good place to find it in. So I'll put their names in the chat. So thank you, and sorry that it wasn't the answer you were necessarily looking for.
Just a reminder that we will, when we write to you after this webinar, give you links to Calum's blog and a number of the articles that have been mentioned. Howard Lyons is a ICMDA board member. Calum, he's asking, why are governments, for example in the UK, so resistant to scientific research about the adverse effects on abortion on women, when in other situations, for example, COVID, they claim to be following the science? There's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your service to ICMDA as well. It's in a sense, it's quite a simple question. There's a lot to it, but the answer really is ideology. A really good example of this, in the main review, which is cited on abortion and mental health, is a study by the National Collaborating Center for Mental Health. It was published in 2011, and it said It said a few things, and it did actually say that there was an association between abortion and mental health, but its general conclusion was that there's not a significant link, and in general, women who have abortions have roughly the same mental health outcomes as women who continue unwanted pregnancies. But what they said was that the evidence for all of the things they looked at, and it was a very detailed study of, well over 100 pages and hugely comprehensive as a systematic review, it said that all of the evidence was very low quality. So we really don't know what the answer is on this question of abortion and mental health. And this is the main study that is cited by pro-abortion advocates to claim that abortion doesn't harm a woman's mental health. But despite the fact that they said that all the evidence was very low quality, in their conclusion, they specifically recommended we should stop looking at this question and should look at other questions, which is a completely bizarre conclusion if they're admitting that the evidence is very poor quality. Generally, if the evidence for an important question is very poor quality, that is a profound incentive to carry on studying that question and get better evidence on it. But they said we should stop looking at it. Likewise, in the same domain, David Ferguson, who I mentioned earlier, his research is widely regarded as the best research on this question. He was actually asked by his government in New Zealand not to publish his findings because of the political consequences that it could have. And so we have some fairly kind of clear ideological or clear evidence that there are ideological motivations behind the suppression of evidence and behind an unwillingness to debate these sorts of topics. And unfortunately, that's getting worse. So if anyone is in the academic space and does want to discuss these questions, it would be great to hear from you to talk more about how we can have these conversations properly in a way that isn't censored or misconstrued. So thank you for that great question.
Thanks, Calum. A question here about the relationship between capital punishment and abortion. Why is it that some countries who are opposed to abortion in their laws back capital punishment and vice versa? Is this a confusion of ethical principles?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I will be upfront and say that, of course, Christians disagree on this, but my own personal position is that I'm opposed to capital punishment, and I would want to see it abolished. I think that people should be given a second chance, and especially a chance to meet Jesus and to receive and experience his forgiveness. And that would be my personal position for why I oppose it. But that's not to say that there's only one Christian position. So that's just kind of to be upfront about where I'm coming from. I would still say, nevertheless, that to have capital punishment and to restrict abortion is not inconsistent. In my view, that's a wrong combination of views to have, but it's still consistent. And the reason it would be consistent is because in the case of capital punishment, you are ending the life of someone who is guilty of a very, very grave crime, usually because they have ended someone else's life. And so in that sense, although I disagree with capital punishment, I think that it is clearly an attempt to uphold the sanctity and importance and infinite value of life by saying that the only way to properly respect the life that has been lost through a murder is by taking the life of the culprit. It's saying that the only way to sort of repay society, the only thing equivalent to a loss of life, is not financial penalties, because a life is worth more than that. The only thing that can compensate for a murder is another loss of life. And so in a way, it's intended to say that human life is infinitely valuable. Whereas on the other hand, abortion, almost by definition, ends the life of an innocent child who has never done anything wrong. And so there's a clear difference between them. So as I say, my position is that I'm against capital punishment. I don't agree with that argument that I gave for it, or I don't find it convincing enough to say that capital punishment should be legal. But I would also say that we shouldn't quickly and, in my view, recklessly accuse people of being inconsistent if they support both pro-life laws and capital punishment. I don't think it's strictly inconsistent. And although I disagree with them, I think that they may well still have coherent worldview, even if it's one that I disagree with. So I hope that helps to explain a bit. Thank you.
Thank you. A more practical or personal question here, anonymously, but lots of votes. How do you cope with the hostility that you must inevitably experience from healthcare professionals and pro-abortionists just for speaking and writing in this whole area?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's easy to sometimes to exaggerate the hostility that we do get. So I certainly get hostility and have had, people threatening to report me to the GMC because I'm pro-life and all sorts of, that's the General Medical Council, the professional regulators in the UK. And so certainly you do get threats and you do get hostility. But it's not, I don't constantly have death threats in my mailbox or anything like that, though of course some pro-life organizations have had death threats. I would really say that you can be encouraged to do the right thing. And a lot of that is through other people being involved. A lot of it is through the Bible. A lot of it is through seeing the perseverance of Christians throughout history who have withstood hostility for doing the right thing and did the right thing because it was the right thing. So I would say that having a support network is crucial, and having the encouragement of other people speaking out is also helpful. And so one way that I'm helped is by having other doctors be vocal about their views and normalize being pro-life. And so we can often get into a vicious cycle where no one wants to talk about this. No one wants to say that they're pro-life publicly. And that makes hostility worse because it looks like I'm the only one. So I would say be bold about being pro-life and be openly pro-life and share the arguments and the evidence with your peers and with the people around you. I think that can be hugely helpful, and you don't need to be afraid. I think there are good legal options available to you, and you have a wonderful family of support in the church and in ICMDA to support you if you do get hostility for it. So I would say be courageous, but also be careful. And, you shouldn't be needlessly provocative or rude about it, but there's plenty of support available. And I'd be glad to talk more about it with anyone who wants to know more about that.
Thanks, Calum. It's often the hard cases which are used to change the law. And this was certainly the case in the UK, where back in the 1960s, it was argued about preventing the birth of disabled children, but also particularly to stop the backstreet abortions and the attendant mortality, a question you've addressed already. But there's a specific question here about the Ireland situation and the very highly publicised case of Dr. Savita Halappanavar, the Indian dentist who died as a result of sepsis, which followed a miscarriage when she was not given an abortion. Any comments on that one? Because I know that changed a lot of people's minds on this issue and swayed them into thinking that it was right to legalise abortion in Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's certainly an understandable point. It was a tragic situation, and a woman lost her life, and her life was infinitely valuable to God and should be to us as well. And so anything that we can do within the bounds of the law and within the bounds of ethics to save the life of a woman like Savita should be done. And it's I believe it grieves God that she died, and it's something that should never happen. I do think, though, that this is a good example of how so much of the media and even some kind of professional authorities can misrepresent what actually happened in order to lobby for legal change. The reality is that Savita had a case of premature rupture of membranes, which meant that as long as that went on, there was an increasing risk of infection, and she went on to develop chorioamnionitis. And as a result of that, she passed away eventually. And it is true to say that good medical practice should have delivered the baby at least as soon as there was a sign of infection or a sign of sepsis. As soon as there is a sign of infection, the baby should be delivered, not intentionally ending its life, but removing it from a dignified way from the mother, knowing that it will pass away in any case in order to try and save the mother's life. So this is not an intentional killing, but this is the baby passing away would be a foreseen consequence of removing it from the mother in order to save her life, and knowing that there was no way the baby would survive whatever you did. So what happened in Savita's case was that the doctors did not recognize that she had an infection quickly enough. And so as a result, the infection developed, and because the infection was too developed by the time they tried to deliver the baby or gave her antibiotics or any other treatment, the infection was so severe that eventually she passed away as a result of sepsis. Now, this is a horrendous thing. What is absolutely clear is that the law in Ireland allowed the baby to be delivered if the woman's life was in danger, as it clearly was, according to any sane clinical judgment in that situation. We know that in countries which ban abortion, situations like this happen frequently. They're not the majority of pregnancies, it's a small minority of pregnancies, but they happen everywhere all over the world. Women have premature rupture of membranes, develop infections, and need to have their babies delivered. There is not a single pro-life country in the world which bans a doctor from delivering that baby in that situation. And so afterwards, the doctors, probably in an attempt to cover their backs, said that we didn't understand the law was unclear, we didn't know whether we could deliver the baby. But the reality is that the law was absolutely clear. The baby was legally permitted to be delivered, and clinical judgment is clear that as soon as there is a sign of infection, the baby should be delivered. So this was simply and very tragically a case of clinical misjudgment and clinical mismanagement that led to the loss of a woman's life. It had nothing to do with the law, which would have allowed the baby to be delivered in that case and perhaps have saved her life. I say much more about this on my website. There's a whole question on this specific woman's case on my website. So if you want to know more, please do go there and have a look. But thank you for that good and important question.
Calum, you mentioned mental health and also premature birth and the sequelae of those. You didn't address the question of breast cancer. Is there any link between abortion and breast cancer, or is the jury really still out on that question?
Yeah, thank you. Let me very quickly say on mental health first, there was a question in the chat that I really do want to answer on the mental health stuff, because it's an important objection and I should have been clearer in the talk. This objection, I can't see the chat, the question now, but it was about you're confusing correlation with causation. Maybe women with more mental health problems were more likely to have abortions in the first place. And that's a perfectly legitimate question. I should have been clearer about this and said that the studies looking at this control for those confounding factors. So they take equivalent women who have the same mental health difficulties or the same prevalence of mental health difficulties and so on, and they control for those pre-existing factors. And even when they do so, they still find that women who have abortions have much worse mental health outcomes. So this can't be explained by a pre-existing factor that women having abortions are more likely to have. So I hope that makes a bit more sense and clears that up. On the question of breast cancer, very briefly then, it's not an area that I have looked into real detail on. As far as I can tell, and I've discussed this with a professor of oncology at one of the world's leading universities, perhaps the world's leading medical school, what I have seen from my research and from discussions with such experts is that we know that having a child at a relatively early age, having a full-term pregnancy at a relatively early age, decreases the risk of a woman getting breast cancer later in life. Whereas by contrast, it would follow that if you end a pregnancy before it reaches full term, that protection against breast cancer is removed. So that seems to be uncontroversial. It's uncontroversial that having a full-term pregnancy at an early age reduces your risk for breast cancer. And of course, having an abortion and therefore not having the pregnancies should return your risk for breast cancer back up to the average. What is much more controversial is whether the specific procedure of having an abortion adds to the risk of breast cancer on top of the average risk that a woman would normally have. That is much more controversial, and it's not a question that I've looked into in detail, and so I wouldn't be comfortable speculating on it. And I think it's important that we're honest about these things, that if we don't know the answer, we shouldn't say the kind of pro-life thing or the thing that helps our case. If I haven't looked at the evidence, I'm not going to make a claim about it. So that would be my position on the breast cancer link. So thank you for that question.
Thanks very much, Calum. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. We have lots more questions coming, and it just shows what an important subject this is to address. But thank you for your comprehensive and evidence-based approach to this, for your commitment and passion in this whole area, and for your integrity also in saying when you're not sure. And there's just so much research, isn't there, to be on top of in this area, and what an important time to be discussing this issue. I think I heard earlier today that the Secretary General of the UN was making claims about mortality statistics and how abortion saves lives, which don't seem to measure up to the evidence that you've presented and which is out there. So thanks again, Calum. Thank you to everyone for coming today, for your many questions, and we hope to see you again shortly on ICMDA webinars. May the Lord bless you.